The following is an account of Jesus' final hours on earth as observed by three individuals who were there. We invite you to sit back and listen as if you were a part of those events so long ago.
It was that time of year. You know, the Passover? It's one of the biggest feasts we celebrate when we remember when God passed over the chosen people of Israel with the angel of death. We were instructed to put the blood of a sacrificial lamb over our doorposts so that the plague of death would not touch us. It was a miracle that we recounted year after year because that angel of death touched every family in Egypt, but not the Israelites. So, as was tradition, we all decided to meet for the Passover meal. We just weren't sure where, since Jesus was now a target in the eyes of the religious leaders, and they were looking for any chance to trap him. But Jesus instructed a couple of us to go into the city. We were supposed to look for a man carrying a jar of water and to follow him. We were to ask the owner of the house that he led us to for a guest room so that our teacher and us could eat the Passover meal. We shouldn't have been surprised when it all played out like he said it would. I mean, when that owner led us to the room so that we could prepare a meal together, we shouldn't have been surprised. You know, we had witnessed our teacher do so many things that took our breath away, but Peter and I, we were still pretty surprised at how everything fell into place. Later that night, we were all there, all 12 of us who had followed him so closely over the past 3 years. He talked with us about many things that night. How he had prayed for us that none would be lost, how his time, whatever that was close at hand, and that we were to love one another and be one, just as he and his Father were one. And at the time, I had no idea what he meant. He talked about how we'd go through hard times, but not to fear or be discouraged because he had overcome the world. He even spoke about how he would send his Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth. And then he did the strangest thing. He got up and he took off his shirt and he wrapped a towel around his waist and he went around to each of us washing our feet. You know, the job our servants would normally do. I mean, it's a dirty job. It's not something a rabbi would do, that's for sure. Of course, Peter didn't want any part of that. He even told him he should never wash Peter's feet. Oh, leave it to Peter. He's always got a grandstand. But Jesus told Peter that unless he washed his feet, Peter would have no part with Jesus. Well, then Peter was ready to take a bath. Man, that guy was always over the top, if you know what I mean. After Jesus washed our feet, he told us that since he, our Lord and teacher, had washed our feet, we were to start doing that for one another. But you know, the part that really got to me was the actual meal. He said something that made us all stop. He said, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover meal with you. And I tell you, I won't drink of the vine again until I drink it anew in heaven. We all looked at each other, wondering what he meant. Would this be our last meal together? I couldn't help but think back to the first day I ever saw him. There was something about him that just drew me. I remember all those adventures we'd had that we shared along the water's edge. You know, we fed thousands of people on a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And at the end of the meal, we picked up baskets of food. And then he healed so many people. He even raised a couple of people from the dead. You know, he introduced me to people that even I, as a fisherman, would never have dared to talk to before. Folks who needed deliverance and forgiveness. He loved them all. We laughed a lot, too. We even swapped a few fishing stories. Peter always had the best ones, but he challenged us, even through those stories. And then he made us think, you know? It was like no teacher I'd ever seen before. It was really more like a shepherd, you know, leading us and sharing daily life with us. could we lose him now? What would we do without him? But then I was brought back to the present when Jesus took the bread. You know, that's part of the Passover meal. And he intentionally broke us, and that's part of it too. But then he said something really weird. He looked around the table at each of us, and he said, "Take this and eat it, for this is my body." We'd never heard anything quite like that before. And to be honest with you, we really weren't sure what he meant. And then he took the cup of wine and he held it up. And again, he looked around the table at each of us and he said, "Take this and drink." He said, "This is the cup of my blood, the blood of the new covenant, the blood which is poured out for each of you for the forgiveness of sins." Man, that stopped us right there. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. We each ate the bread and we took a sip from the cup. But it was like time stood still. And we knew that moment was bigger than any of us. And then he said something else that caught us by surprise. He said that one of the 12, would betray him. He just let that hang there, you know? Of course, we all looked at each other wondering who. We kept watching. But then everyone kind of got back into conversation, and you know how guys get. We all started arguing about who was the greatest. I don't know. I was still pretty uneasy about it all. And I was sitting right next to Jesus, so I could really see what happened. I noticed that Judas had dipped his bread into Jesus' cup, and that he and Jesus, they looked at each other for a long time, like they were sharing a moment, you know? Jesus told him to do what he had to do. And then the next thing I knew, Judas was gone. And then the meal went on like nothing happened, and we sang a hymn before we left the room. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord?
He asked a few of us to come with him to the garden. We'd hung out there before, so I didn't think anything of it. It was a quiet place to talk amidst the olive grove, where we could clearly see Jerusalem in the distance, across the valley. But this night was different. Jesus didn't want to talk with us. Instead, he asked us to pray that we wouldn't fall into temptation. That kind of took me aback. I mean, I'd already told him I would follow him anywhere. He had nothing to worry about me being tempted to leave him. But then he walked over to a big old olive tree and kind of collapsed on the ground, leaning his head against the trunk of the tree, and started quietly praying. I'd never seen Jesus in such anguish. His words got quieter and quieter as I got sleepier. I tried to stay awake to hear what he was saying, but, well, it had been a long day and I needed some sleep. My dreams were wild that night. Suddenly, I was back in the boat with him sleeping on a cushion while we were frantically trying to keep afloat with waves crashing over the sides in the storm. I remember screaming at him, "Don't you even care if we sink?" Sometimes Jesus seemed so oblivious to all our problems, but then he simply raised his arm and said in a calm voice, "Be still." And the lake became instantly smooth. I was stunned. My dreams jumped from one memory to another. Like the time he hugged the leper that no one else would go near, and he told him, "I am willing, be healed." And right there before my eyes, this leper, who was covered in sores, was completely clean. I mean, no more sores. The scary thing was that in my dream, I was the leper.
Can't you even stay awake for a little while to pray with me?
His voice startled me back awake. The teacher was soaked in sweat and looked sad. I sat up and couldn't quite find the right words, but just nodded. He then turned and went back to the tree. I watched from the distance at the shadow of my master leaning up against the tree, looking up to heaven with beads of sweat coursing down his face. In a shaft of moonlight, Jesus appeared to be weeping. I'd seen him cry before, like when his friend Lazarus died, but it was as if he was looking on his own forthcoming death. A look of sadness mixed with horror. And with the haunting sound of crickets in the air, I swear I heard him groan. I don't know when, but shortly after, I closed my eyes. I saw him again in my dreams. He was laughing, surrounded by a crowd at a wedding. This was so like Jesus. He was always so quick with the story and quick to enjoy someone else's story. He really was the life of any party.
I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me.
I remembered the scene as he uttered those words just a few hours earlier at our meal. He said it to Thomas after he commented that none of us knew where he was going. Suddenly, I felt the nudge on my shoulder.
Peter, get up.
I was startled, scrambling to my feet to catch a glimpse of what the others were looking at. In the distance, I saw a stream of torchlights coursing down the road into the valley from the city gate toward us. The crowd looked like a column of ants ready to take their prey. It all happened so quickly. Suddenly, we were surrounded by a legion of centurions with swords drawn, as if we were a whole army to take down. I grabbed a sword as quickly as I could, but Jesus told me to put the sword away. There was so much we could have done, so much we should have done. But in the end, we were all scattered, and the teacher was led off like a convict in the night. Everything happened so fast, and I couldn't tell you where we all ran off to. I know I just ran and ran, my heart beating so fast, finally finding shelter behind a big old tree overlooking the valley. What was I doing? Why was I hiding? I told Jesus I wouldn't abandon him ever. And here I was, crouching like a child, behind a tree trunk. Under cover of night, I finally began following the soldiers in hopes of seeing where they were taking Jesus. It didn't seem long before they entered the courtyard of Caiaphas, the high priest. I barely slipped in through the gate without anyone noticing me. I ended up huddled with the others around the fire outside, wondering what was happening inside the house. It was a cold night, and I was lost in my thoughts, panicked about what would happen to Jesus. I barely heard the accusation of the servant girl sitting near me, claiming I had been with Jesus. It wasn't until I noticed those around me glaring at me that I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. I don't know him. At least, that seemed to get the attention off of me. But a little while later, someone else accused me of being one of them. Again, I denied it. After all, how could I help Jesus if I were arrested? I figured it was done. Now I could at least mull over how I could help. But then, about an hour later, another person standing near me said, pointing to me, "This is a Galilean. Surely he is one of his followers." I was horrified, terrified, really. And I suddenly blurted out, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just then, I heard a rooster crow. Looking in its direction, I saw through an opening in the doorway Jesus standing in shackles. He turned and looked at me. A look I will never forget as long as I live.
Peter was nowhere to be found when they led Jesus before Pilate. I had found his mother, Mary, and the other Mary, the one they call the Magdalene. She'd followed him continually after he delivered her from her demons. Both were stunned to learn of what had happened in that night. Although, oddly enough, his mom didn't seem surprised, just in shock that it was finally happening. I guess she'd known all along he would be taken down. We worked our way through that crowd, trying to get a glimpse of him. The governor stood tall and proud over the crowd on his little platform. And finally, we saw Jesus as they led him to stand before Pilate. I remember gasping. I barely recognized him. He was so bloodied, and one eye was swollen shut. The crowd began screaming all sorts of accusations, claiming he didn't deserve to live. When Pilate silenced everyone and announced he'd found no basis for the charges they brought against him, the crowd went wild, screaming for his death. Pilate tried to silence them again and again. The soldiers were holding back the mob, trying to rush the platform. I think maybe Pilate was just starting to get scared for his own life. When he tried to appeal to the protesters by offering to release Barabbas and having Jesus just be scourged, they drowned him out. They kept screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" In the end, Pilate just washed his hands, claiming he had no part in Jesus' execution. He gave the crowd what they wanted, releasing the murderer Barabbas and having Jesus led away to be crucified.
Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes he causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree?
You know, as a little girl, you dream about being a mommy. You diaper, feed, and clothe your dolly, just knowing that one day when you grow up, you're going to be the best mommy there ever was. But nothing could have prepared me for this. Who ever heard of a virgin birth? I certainly hadn't. All I know is one day I was a 13-year-old girl without a worry in the world, and the next thing I knew, I was pregnant in a world full of worries. All I remember is there was a lot of light and a voice so calm and clear telling me that I had been chosen. Me, chosen to be the mother of God, the Messiah, the one we'd been waiting for. Me. Why me? I remember back then wondering if I had just dreamed it all up, this vision from God. But then came the morning sickness, and before I knew it, I started gaining weight. And then the first kick. Let me tell you, you can't imagine what it feels like to be kicked by God. Of course, wouldn't you know, we were traveling at the time of Jesus' birth. We'd been traveling all day, and the contractions had been going on for some time. Joe, he did his best to make me comfortable, using our things to make a little bed, since the only place we could find to stay was an old cave used by farm animals. The contractions really kicked in around midnight. Till finally, about 2:30 in the morning, he came. He came. All the questions, all the worries, everything I had fretted about just stopped. It was as if, for a few minutes, the world stood still when he came. He was so cute. Just lying there, helpless, cooing and crying, and then eating. He was so hungry. Just me, Joseph, and Jesus. Probably the last time we'd have such peace, but, the quiet was interrupted not long after by a whole group of local shepherds. Farm workers. They were pretty dirty and loud, but they seemed to experience the same thing when they saw him. Everyone was quiet as we looked down at this little, helpless baby, the Savior of all, the one who would, how was it put, one day be the rise and fall of the world. I loved being his mommy. I really did. He was such a good little boy. Don't get me wrong, he was all boy. He loved to run and climb on things. I was forever bandaging his knees. And he was always bringing home a stray animal. Sometimes a dog, sometimes a cat, sometimes a kid that no one else would play with. He was the same way as an adult, forever being drawn to the ones that no one else wanted to be around. It was as if trouble followed him. Interestingly enough, wherever he went, things happened. Things happened. If it wasn't stopping a woman of the night from being stoned, it was someone being delivered from demons. If you expected a quiet evening, Jesus was not the one to hang with. It was just the truth. You couldn't know Jesus and remain indifferent. Either you loved him or you hated him. Of course, he didn't exactly endear himself to the religious leaders, And the gang that followed him, such a group. There were 12 guys that followed him incessantly, and we're not talking a quiet group of refined gentlemen. No, these were rough, smelly fishermen, and even a tax collector to boot. The mouths on some of those boys. But he loved them. And as many times as they made mistakes, he stayed with them till the very end. The end came a lot quicker than any of us had expected. Jesus was only 33 when they accused him of trying to overthrow everything the Pharisees held near and dear to their hearts. I believe the crime was blasphemy. Only 33 when they beat him, trying to force a confession of some kind of conspiracy. Only 33 when they slapped the thorns on his head and put a crossbeam over his bloodied back. I'll tell you this. A mother should never have to watch her child suffer the way Jesus did. It was one thing to hear them ridicule and vilify him, but when they pounded those stakes into his wrists, well, I felt as if they'd pierced a stake right through my heart. Was he crazy? Some say he was. And maybe to some degree he was by our standards. I mean, I think it takes some kind of craziness to love this sick world the way he did. But let me ask you something. Is it crazy to want to see a lame man walk or a blind girl see for the first time? Is it crazy to want people set free from the demons that have tormented them all their lives? Or to teach people how to truly love each other? Or to see people for what they can become rather than what they've settled for? Even there, on the cross, with convicts on either side of him, ones that really deserved their punishment, he was speaking grace. He was speaking grace. To the one who asked that he remember him when he went to heaven, Jesus told him he would be in paradise with him that very day. Is that craziness? To teach people that they have a Father in heaven who loves them so much that he's just dying for them to know that? Yeah. I guess you could say that's crazy. But such craziness. Such craziness. This world could use a whole lot more of.
We stood there a long time after everyone else had gone. There, at the foot of the cross. My friend, my teacher, my Savior hung there as others turned away, having had their share of mocking. I watched his blood trickle down the rough wood as the clouds grew ominously dark overhead. He told me to look after his mother. His breathing became labored. He's pushing up on the nails of his feet, just trying to gasp for air as he asked his Father to forgive them, the mockers. They didn't know what they had done. And then he simply looked up to heaven. With a loud groan, he said, "It is finished." With that, his head dropped, and Jesus let out his last breath. He was dead.
Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished.
We thank you for joining us for this interpretive account. If you'd like the rest of the story, tune in on Sunday as we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. If you've found this account on YouTube and would like to learn more about Red Rocks Fellowship, you can find us at www.redrocksefc.org. Our prayer and hope for you is that you find God's grace and peace and hope that He has made available to all people in this Easter season. God bless you.